And we're back, and we're moving into our second conversation for today. We are joined by two representatives of the Belize Association of Planners, also known as BAP. And we have with us Carolyn Sandiford, who is the president and executive director, and we have Eric Sanchez, who is the community development representative and also a planner. Good morning.
Good morning.
And we're talking about World Urbanism Day. Now, this is a brand new word, I think, to bring into context today. So let's just start off by talking about what the Association of Planners does and how we commemorate this day.
Thank you very much for having us here. And I brought with me Eric Sanchez. I need to recognize that he's one of our young and upcoming planners. Mm-hmm. And as is the modus operandi of the Belize Association of Planners, we try to find spaces for our young people and our young professionals, because we're being phased out and the new ones are coming in. So I want to recognize him and all the young planners who have recently returned home and are now working. Belize Association of Planners, we were incorporated in 2013 with a main focus to address development challenges in Belize. It's a profession like any other profession. Unfortunately, it's not a well-known profession, but it's a very critical profession in terms of how we manage the growth and development of Belize. And so this year we felt that in stepping up what we do and bringing about more visibility and credibility to our profession, we thought of recognizing and commemorating World Town Planning Day. Now, this is not a new thing. And you said World Urbanism Day, and I start by saying World Town Planning Day because originally that was how it started. 70 years ago. Towns. Right, World Town Planning, because it was always a profession that was referred to as town planning. In fact, one of our first planners, Henry Fairweather, who is a mentor of ours and who goes down in the annals of Belizean history when it comes to planning, having planned the first town in Belize, which was Coruscant town. He was a town planner. But with urbanization and the fact that more people are living in urban communities, and urban communities are no longer just towns, they're cities, and they're suburbs, and they're towns and villages, and so on and so forth. There's now a transition from the World Town Planning Day, which started some 70 years ago, to now World Urbanism Day. So you're going to still hear the word World Town Planning Day, but it's moving now to World Urbanism Day. And bringing focus on the challenges of urbanization. If it's not planned and managed, then urbanization by itself can bring about increasing poverty, increasing environmental degradation, and so on and so forth.
But aren't we still living in a time where we look at certain distinctions from what is urban and what is rural? So if we're looking at that perspective where we say Belize City and Belmopan, the towns and the villages, we're looking at a system or a structure where we're identifying only two known urban areas, the rest are what we call out district. How does that work in the context of development?
And that's a very interesting perspective, and I'm glad you brought it up because it was also recognized in the 2010 population census, where the authors of the document indicated that our population is changing, and also areas that we used to consider rural are no longer rural. Now, how we define rural and urban, I think that's very key, because rural is normally defined as anything that is not urban, and then rural is normally linked to some agricultural activity, so the economy of the communities are based strictly on agriculture. So when you say Belize City, Belmopan, those two cities, because it's the city of Belmopan and Belize City, their economy was never based on agriculture per se. Belize City was always a port city. For the importation and exportation of the resources exploited from our country. Belmopan became the administrative capital. And then Coruscant Town, Orange Walk Town, those were linked to the sugar industry. If you go south, Dangriga was linked to the citrus industry and so on and so forth. But that has changed.
Well, and that was going to be my question, because I think when we think of the urban-rural distinction, it really has gotten quite murky for us here in Belize, because if you look at population centers, which is what Belize City is, that's one thing. But we have the classification, and I know we can go smaller, but we'll start with village, town, and city.
That's right.
But there's some villages that are as big as towns, and there's some
Bigger than
towns that are generating more revenue than cities.
Exactly.
So where exactly do we, I mean, we have what is in our social studies book and what our children will continue to learn today, but they're not all the same anymore.
And you're quite right, and I think that is where the Belize Association of Planners have come in. Because one of our focus over the past few years have been to bring about that knowledge and awareness that our settlements in Belize are changing and evolving, and we can no longer be linked to the traditional concepts of urban and rural. You pointed out something about our villages growing. You're quite right. We have villages that have populations that are more than towns.
Yeah.
You look at Ladyville and Punta Gorda
Exactly.
as a
But
classic
even
example.
in Cayo too.
Exactly. And villages that are now merging with towns. And so the populations are growing, but it is not being managed. So the whole governance structure. In fact, earlier I was listening to you talking to Honorable Julius Espat on governance issues and accountability and transparency and how funding is centered, trickle down. Where does it trickle down?
Yeah.
The reality, if we continue to think of Belize City, Belmopan, and the 7 municipalities as urban only, and the rest of the country as rural, then all those villages, those 201 villages, are governed by a village council act, which does not even provide the revenue base to manage and respond to the needs of those villages. And the more the population grows, the more you're dealing with solid waste issues, the more you're dealing with housing, land for housing, the more you're dealing with jobs, the more you're dealing with infrastructure, sewer, water, electricity. And so it's very important for us as planners to bring forth this knowledge and to say, you know, Belize needs to start rethinking how we classify our settlements, that's one, and how we manage our settlements to ensure that we don't move towards a trajectory where people are living in deplorable environments, where people are not living in leading productive lives, where communities are not successful, where we are not including people in spaces and planning for the elderly, for the young people, and so on and so forth.
So how do we, I mean, I don't know what triggers a reclassification, but what needs to be done? Because I think the point that you made is perhaps what not many people think about. Yes, you live in a big village, but there's a difference. If you have a town council, which has its own set of regulations, its own set of voting processes and execution and duties, versus a village council and what their role and responsibilities would be. If you look at, let's look at something that's a village. One, Ladyville, which is very populated, but look at Keycocker.
Yes.
Keycocker is a village.
Exactly.
And yes, it has few people, but what are they generating and what is the work that they're doing as well?
And one of the things with the village classification, when we say agriculture, it takes into consideration fishes and fishing and so on and so forth. And if you may recall, San Pedro Town, Kikaka Village, Placencia, these were all villages that were linked to fishing industry, but they're now linked to tourism, which is a service industry, which again brings its own challenges.
Which is our current largest revenue
exactly.
earner.
And so this is where for us as planners, we are kind of starting this year to kind of step up the ante, if we can, if I can say so. And we're trying to find ways in which we could create that awareness. And we felt that recognizing and commemorating World Urbanism Day, just like how you have World Diabetes Day, World Population Day, whatever, we have World Urbanism Day and World Town Plan. And to bring about knowledge and awareness of planning and planners and the critical role that planners play in society.
So how does a young planner fit into this landscape, so to speak?
And I will have him answer that one.
I think that as a younger person, more as a young planner, I recently graduated from the Vancouver Island University from a full scholarship in last year, 2018. And going to, before attending this school, I really had no idea what urban planning is or town planning is on a grand scale. I think as I grew more every day within my course, I realized how important something like urban planning becomes and how essential an urban planner becomes to a municipality, whether the municipality is a village, a city, a town, or just a community. And as a younger person, I want to think that I don't just only bring newer set of information, newer set of best practices, but I'm also privileged enough to have the capacity to be mentored by persons like Miss Carolyn, who has been in the game for a very long time. But at the same time, I think that we have enough energy to then take up the good fight of actually going around, actually emphasizing the importance of an urban planner. And I think that is something that is vitally missing within Belize. As how can we have so many municipalities in varying degrees of municipalities, but we don't have any urban planner who are trained in urban planning to execute these phases. And then we don't have that respect for someone as an urban planner, when in reality, an urban planner has the capacity to control most, if not all, of the functions of a city. And then you beg to ask the question, how can you then give such a high recognition to an architect, but an architect has to follow the rules of an urban planner? You know, it's like, how can you, which comes first? You know, and of course, not to be bashful to any profession, because an architect is essentially important, but at the same time, an urban planner is equally important to that of an architect or a civil engineer, an engineer. You know, so I think that as a young person, that's where I want to fit in within this context.
But what we have done, I guess this is a recurring theme in our show, but what we've done over the past few years is kind of just skip that part. It's like, it is essential, but we won't fall apart if we skip the urban planning part. And once upon a time, we did skip the architect part as well. Thankfully, that's changed. Because soundness of structures are now a realistic thing for us. But I want to go back though, because what you're pointing out in terms of town planning is so critical. What do we do to reclassify? How does a country, because I'm completely, I don't know, how do we change the classification, or do we need to change the classifications?
That would be a very interesting question that we needed to also pose to the Housing and Population Census Directorate next year.
Okay.
Because, you know, 2020 is the census period. And they have been in fact, I have had discussions with them, and they are aware, like I said, it is stated, but it is a legislative decision. It's a decision of the policymakers and the executive branch of government.
Of course.
To basically say, this is how we are now going to move and why. I think we have not had the kind of conversation at the policy level because we tend to do things in silos. And so we continue with the status quo, and we are not doing the necessary research, nor are we looking at the data that exists that can guide us. The 2010 Housing and Population Census was very clear. It stated it, but it was not their duty to basically declare it. They can't make that declaration unless the government so decides. So I think one of the roles of the association then is that we have taken on this advocacy role to say that we are going to use our skill set and knowledge, and we are going to build this awareness as to why there needs to be some reclassification. Now, when we talk reclassification, it doesn't necessarily mean that we classify differently. It may mean what is the criteria. And I think that is how you want to look at it, because the criteria for your hierarchy of settlements is normally based on two key things. One, the population you serve, right? Right?
How many people live in the area?
How many people live in the area, and your functionality within the national development perspective. What is the role of settlements in delivering services to the people of Belize?
Can I chime in then to say, if I were to look at two particular locations, I've mentioned Ladyville before, and it was brought to my attention over the weekend. You have a community such as Bay Vista down south. I was told, and this is from someone who works within the education ministry, that, for instance, in Bay Vista, they have the largest primary school in the entire country with 1,000 primary school students. So much so that they had to build another school to accommodate the number of students going to school there. You're looking at a particular concentration of people living in a particular area that, for all intents and purposes, seems to outnumber Independence or another village nearby, that doesn't get a classification as a town.
Because
If you look at Ladyville, it's the same thing. If you look at Ladyville, it's the same thing. Ladyville has all the facilities, the amenities, and everything that would, in my opinion, classify it as a town.
That's right.
Except that when it does become labeled as such, the tax regime and everything else changes to accommodate township.
And that's why knowledge building is important, because one has to start the process of having the conversation. You mentioned Bella Vista. One of the things we don't do is we don't do projections. Projections of population change is very important because it sets the trends and patterns. We were able to do and say what we are saying and starting this kind of awareness because we sat down as planners and we saw what was happening. So we started to bring it out. Now, Bella Vista, for example, in my opinion, and what the projections are going to show, is going to be larger than Punta Gorda because it's one of the fastest growing villages in the country. So it's going to be, the population is going to be more than Punta Gorda. How can we continue to allow these villages, whether it's Bella Vista, whether it's Trial Farm merging with Orange Walk Town, whether it's the Independence, Placencia, Mango Creek region, whether it is Camalote, which is also growing,
Roaring Creek, which is that jump outside of Belmopan.
As you mentioned, Lord's Bank is tying up in with
Ladyville.
and then you have Sandhill and all. So you're having this conglomeration of urban communities merging. We need then as policymakers, and this is where the policy and decision makers, I think, need to step up their game because they're not doing the necessary projections, which is basically saying based on trends from over the past 20 years, this is what we see happening and this is what we're going to expect. And it is going to be very important for us when it comes in the next 5-10 years because you're going to then begin to see where without the proper management systems and the governance systems in place, a simple thing that is happening in some communities, the proliferation of bars. Why? Because the only income the village council have is from a license. So that has social implications. You spoke about Bella Vista and the expansion of the school. You need land, like I said, for housing, for education, for healthcare. So unless we start pulling this data together and saying where our country is going in terms of the settlement patterns and trends, and not only how we look at settlement patterns and trends in terms of the country, but how we look at land within urban communities. And this is where profession, technical areas like Eric becomes very important because it's not just about the settlement trends and patterns, it's what's happening and contained within a settlement. We are having urban blight and decay. You can move into some communities, overgrown, abandoned buildings, poor housing, high unemployment, so on and so forth. How do we change that to make these communities more successful, more productive, have spaces for people? Those things have to be addressed.
But it's interesting because as you build these connections for us this morning, we have all the examples to show why without urban planning, we have a lot of challenges. I mean, we look around Belize City and we know even from looking what's a commercial area, what's not a commercial area, consideration for parking, whether there are enough jobs, you know, even just ambulances, as simple as that, or fire department. Those are all things to be taken into consideration. So we have all these examples to show what happens when you don't plan, but we still haven't taken it as seriously because I imagine in an area like Bella Vista, for example, if a town planner or a planner gets their hands on it, they can be able to put in the proper, whether it's water system, emergency care system, a clinic that would be functional, because if you have this concentration of people, the last thing you want to do is to get the ambulance that come from Dangriga to Bella Vista to take them back to Dangriga for.
And that's why I mentioned the point that we have to look at two things: the population that you serve and the functionality, because the role of the state is to provide services to its residents.
Yeah.
And so you have to look at a town or a village in terms of who do they serve and how do they link back to a national development trajectory. And those things are very important. And I think that is where, for us from World Town Planning Day and trying commemorating, it is to start this process. It's a challenge for us as planners because we don't have resources per se to be doing a lot. So
you're not a government entity.
Exactly, we are not a government, but we are professionals, and we want our profession to be recognized, just like the attorneys, just like the engineers, just like the architects, and so on. You mentioned earlier when Eric was talking, you said, well, the architect. All professions are important.
Yes, yes.
But we need to be able to balance them all. Why is it, for example, and I can use this as a classic example. I had to review a document the other day with a budget which calls for an attorney that speaks to $300 an hour. If a planner puts $300 a day, you start hearing, how do I have to charge so much? But here you have a city that have all these hills and these urban communities, just like you mentioned, that have all these hills. Who is it that is going to resolve it? It's only planners who can come in with the necessary technical expertise to address them. And
can you fix a problem like an unplanned city like Belize?
I will leave that to Eric.
I think that one of the things that we have to remember is to kind of scope what planning is, what an urban planner does. And one of the easiest way that I've learned to do it is to say, have you ever played the game Sims?
No.
Urban planning is like SimCity and all those city planning games. Sims is urban planning in real life, right? And you got to start focusing on dividing what an urban planner does, because you have transportation planner, you have park planners, you have planning lawyers, you have strategic planners, you have funeral planners, which is actually a part of urban planning, and you have this whole array of planners. So then you look at that doesn't even look at tourism or heritage planning.
I'm so sorry, you said all these planners and looking at all the challenges in each specific area.
Precisely, but then you have
we run out of space at the morgue because the city's too big.
And then you look at things, the technical support that an urban planner brings. For instance, a park. A park should always be, there should always be a park within 400 meters of a person or of a child, right? You look at parks versus schools, versus how does that interact with the transportation, and how does the transportation interact with, for instance, a fire safety area, or how does it interact with roundabouts? Do we build roundabouts without overpass? Because if we don't build an overpass around a roundabout, then it essentially defeats the purpose of a roundabout.
Then they run across it.
You know, and so you go back to say, can a city like Belize City be fixed or improved? Yes, easily, right? But you need the people who have the technical support to do it. My dad once said, if we're in a plane and the plane is about to crash because the pilot passes away or faints, needless you look at me because I'm not a pilot. So then why do we then look at persons who have no degree or no experience in urban planning to do urban planning? It doesn't make sense, because I will never go to a carpenter to do a heart surgery. So why then must I, as a city, go to somebody who is not a planner?
You're speaking to a tradition or a cultural frame of mind that has long plagued Belize, where
we're reactive.
Not only are we reactive, but we don't look to the right people to guide us in a particular direction. we look for the next best thing, but not necessarily the best thing.
The quickest route.
Yeah.
You know how many times I work on, my office is on Alexandra Street. And I can tell you the exact time of the day when the traffic is going to be blocked. And then I ask myself, suppose you spoke about fire. Suppose there's a need for an ambulance or a fire engine, because these are narrow streets. Right? How do you resolve that pathway for the vehicles can't even go to the side? So those are the issues that you bring in your planners, right? When you look at an area that is coming urban blight and decay, like I said, unemployment, overgrown spaces and abandoned spaces, poor housing. You bring in your planners, because your planners come in and look at the data and do the redesign to revitalize. So planners do get involved in economic development. Planners get involved in housing. Planners get involved in recreation and leisure space. One of the examples Eric, I remember saying to us, is he studied in Vancouver, and he was saying there was a mass exodus of young people out of Vancouver. Why? Because there's no nightlife and there's no space. So you have to be planning for the young people. We're now looking at the challenges of Belize. You're now looking at an aging population. That's another dynamics we're not looking at. We're looking at two things in terms of our urban demographics. We're looking at what we call the reverse urbanization, where you're having the rise of these intermediate settlements, the villages and so on. But you're also looking, that is happening at the same time that we're having an aging population. So when you start talking about aging population, you have to then start designing to accommodate the aged people. We're not thinking along that.
And also, just because it's a very important point to hammer home, I think Missy mentioned that we had roughly 192 villages across the country. Now, for each village to develop or to access funding for the community development, they have to have an official community plan, or what we would have traditionally called a master plan. There's no community in Belize that has an accepted by cabinet, I forgot the word, a ratified, legally ratified document that says this is how the community is going to grow. Now, how can you have 192
because we work in election cycle. It would have to be a 5-year plan.
But you see the tradition for urban planning.
But it's a reality. No, it's a reality. And I think, again, that is why, from our standpoint, as planners, I say we continue to try in our own way to bring awareness and build knowledge and say to our people of Belize, we need to start rethinking how we do things. If we're to unleash the potential of this nation, if we're to ensure that our communities develop in such a way that every citizen have the opportunity to be successful, to be productive, if we're going to use space and optimize, especially in light of issues like climate change, the aging population, rising inequality,
revenue generation,
resource depletion. Those things are going to come crashing down on us one day, and those are the things that trigger revolts.
All right. Well, you guys have, you know, if I had a magic wand, I'd put an urban planner in.
But I just would want to, if you would allow me to just make a note to say that we're commemorating World Urbanism Day, World Town Planning Day. It's Friday, November the 8th. I have reached out to the president of the Mayors Association, who is Mayor Khalid Belal. So Belmopan will be joining us. He's putting off an exhibition called Belmopan Past, Present and Future at the George Price Center. And we're encouraging all other municipalities and to do some activity to commemorate and recognize the day. As well, the Belize Association of Planners will be launching its newsletter, so that we want to keep people involved and engaged in the work and activities that we're doing to bring credibility and legitimacy to the profession of planning.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for coming in and just sharing a snippet of what's involved in planning, but really opening our eyes to the importance of it. So thank you.
Thank you too for having us.
We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll be talking about vegan options at Martha's Cafe. So please stay tuned.